Good morning, everybody. Welcome to today's 1 million by 1 million strategy roundtable for entrepreneurs. 1M by 1M, as you know, is the first and only global virtual accelerator for technology startups in the world. Our mission is to help 1 million entrepreneurs reach $1 million in annual revenue and beyond. And in support of that mission, we do these roundtables, these free mentoring roundtables, week after week after week. This is the 537th session. Over 150,000 people have participated in these since we first started in the fall of 2008. It was an experiment. At the time, we didn't know if this kind of online mentoring would work, but it has worked. It has worked, and it has worked famously. So it's also spawned a lot of other innovation within the, incubation, acceleration, entrepreneurship education space through the 1 million by 1 million initiative. We launched 1M by 1M in 2010, so these roundtables predate the actual 1M by 1M program. The event is being recorded. Every single recording is available on the YouTube channel 1M1M Roundtables. Please feel free to check them out. It's evergreen learning content. So whatever episode you listen to, you will learn a lot from. And the entire who's who of the technology industry has been on this show. So we have a big surprise for you today as well. We're going to have a great time. If you're live tweeting today, please use hashtag 1M1M. Our handles on Twitter are at 1M by 1M and at Stromana. We publish a lot of interesting, educational, informative content, so please check that out. This is a roundtable, not a broadcast, so we do want you to participate. I will open up the line for you to dial in and converse a little bit later. We do have scheduled programming first. It's with great pleasure that I welcome our guest today, Dharmesh Shah, founder and CTO at HubSpot. Dharmesh is a wonderful participant in the startup ecosystem and has been for a very, very long time. We have followed each other's work for many, many, many years, and we share an alma mater, MIT. So I'm so thrilled to have you on the show, Dharmesh. Welcome.
Thrilled to be here. Thanks for having me. Yeah, and I think it goes back. It has to be like over 15 years or something like that. I can kind of recall back on the early days when you were just getting this started.
Yeah, we were blogging in the beginning. Remember?
I do. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, Malik actually got me started with blogging. He's like, "Oh, you're so opinionated. You have to start blogging." I'm like, "What is blogging?"
Yeah.
So I am going to spend a significant amount of today's show, depending on how much time Dharmesh can spare for us, to really capture his story, his lessons from the trenches, and his insights, both the entrepreneurial journey as well as his insights on angel investing. So those of you who are following this or listening to the recording, that is what you will expect from the next hour or perhaps even a bit more. So we will start at the very beginning of your journey, Dharmesh. Where did you grow up? What kind of upbringing? What kind of circumstances were you raised in? I know you come from a part of India that is particularly entrepreneurial, so I'm sure that has something to do with it. But tell us a bit more about your childhood.
Sure. So I was born in a small town in Gujarat called Ankleshwar. When I say small, I mean like really, really small. So, no paved streets, no traffic lights, no hospital. So I was born with a midwife at my mom's family side of the house. And then I lived my early years in the town called Billimora, which is not that far away, also in Gujarat, near Surat, if people are familiar with Gujarat. And the funny thing is, you mentioned entrepreneurship being kind of in the water and in the blood, so to speak. If you had talked to any of my family, any of my friends, anyone that knew me, I would have been kind of picked the last person or least likely to actually ever start a company. That was just not my not my personality. I was a very quiet kid, and I wasn't, all the kind of attributes people associate with entrepreneurship in terms of being extroverted and being able to sell, being able to kind of hustle and bustle and get things done. I was the exact opposite of those things. So it was kind of a little bit surprising to many, including myself, that I actually would wind up being an entrepreneur. I was an unlikely one. But my childhood was relatively modest. The house that I grew up in my early years didn't have TV, didn't have hot running water, so we had to kind of heat the water up on in a pail and take it to the bathroom to get hot water. So it was modest, I will say. Not, but then my dad came over on a student visa over to the United States, and he came alone because that's how immigration worked back then. My mom and I kind of stayed in India for a little while, and so I got to spend some years when I came over. I think I was 5 or 6 years old, and spent some time here in the States, spent some time in Canada, and then right in high school, the entire family moved back to India for a couple of reasons. One is my grandfather passed away, so we wanted to kind of support my grandmother, and so I had 2 siblings at the time, and so we all just kind of packed our bags, left Canada, and went back to India, and I enrolled in high school there. So I had high school in India, and did a couple of years of undergrad in India in mechanical engineering, of all things, because I'm not mechanical at all. I have, India is one of those things you kind of take the board exams. At least this is how it works in Gujarat. I think it works there elsewhere. And it's kind of on a rank system, so you get to kind of choose based on what your score is of these kind of disciplines that you have access to. And that was the best kind of engineering-ish thing I could get into. So that's what I did, and I came over, and then we'll kind of get into the entrepreneurial part of the story. But so my parents had, subsequently, while I was an undergrad, moved back to the United States. They were here, living here permanently, and I was living with my grandmother and family in India. And I came to visit them, while during the summer of my second year in college. And people had always told me, it's like, Dharmesh, you really like math, which I do. And so you should check out this quote unquote computer stuff. And, it's like, okay, I'd heard of them. My high school had 0 computers. My engineering college, which was a big college, over 1,000 students, had, I think, 4 computers. And I never got to once touch any of those computers because they were off limits, except for, people that were seniors further along. And we don't think about this here in the United States that much, but, computers, outside of just buying the computer, which is expensive, running a computer in India is actually expensive because you have to have an air-conditioned room. It has to be relatively clean in order to kind of keep the computer running. So I never got a chance to touch a computer while I was in high school or undergrad. So I came here, and my family was living in Indiana, the state of Indiana, and nearby there was Purdue University, and they had summer classes on like an introduction to computers kind of thing. And I'm like, okay, well, people have always told me I should check this out, so I'm going to go check it out. Enrolled in and this was the proverbial kind of love at first sight moment, right? It's like from the day I first sat down with a computer, I'm like this is it. This is the thing I am meant to do. I am supposed to do. And so even though I had not packed any of my things, I was scheduled to just be there for the summer and go back and kind of resume my engineering college there. I literally I didn't go back, right? I'm like, okay, whatever I need, I'll buy here. And I enrolled myself that fall into undergrad computer science. It's like, this is my path now. And haven't looked back. I was fortunate to kind of find that love, that passion early on. I think I would have probably likely discovered computers, might have been another 5 or 10 years, but it was nice. Not as early as I would have liked. I would have liked to have kind of grown up with it, as my son is now doing. He's 10 years old. But yeah, that's my story. And so then, so I've been in computer software for pretty much most of my professional life. But that's the story.
Yeah. So and you did University of Alabama for computer science, and then you did an MBA at MIT, yeah?
Yeah. So I started computer science at Purdue for the first years, because that's where my family happened to be, and then I transferred down to. I moved down to Alabama. It's a long story. It's not that great of a story. And then, so finished my computer science degree at University of Alabama, Birmingham, and then did my MS in the management of technology at MIT at Sloan.
Mm-hmm. And that brings us to what year?
That brings us to, I will say, 93, I'm going to say. Well, no, that catches us up to 2004. 2004, yeah.
2004, okay. So, I mean, something happened in between, right? So you must have done something else
Yeah,
between
so I did two startups, right? One in the mid 90s, that was my first one. I was 24 years old at the time. My co-founder was 17 and a half. Didn't know anything about business or startups or financing or anything. This was in Birmingham, Alabama, which was not the kind of startup center of the universe by any stretch of the imagination. And this was, I guess, an early lesson, which is, we automatically assume that entrepreneurship requires this kind of deep kind of well of knowledge, right? That's like, oh, you have to get certified in entrepreneurship in order to be able to go start a company. And yes, it's helpful to know things, and it's amazing the content that you deliver and that's out there now. But back then there was no internet, there was no.
Wasn't there? I have to say, I had to make so many mistakes to learn the basics, which now we can teach in like 1 hour, basically.
I know. It's in a way, it's actually harder for entrepreneurs now than it was then. So then, nobody knew anything. So you weren't really expected to know much if you were a first-time entrepreneur, and you kind of learned as you went, and it was fine. Entrepreneurs today have a little bit harder because there's so much material out there. The expectation is that you have at least absorbed some of the material that's readily available. Otherwise, you're just going to be at a disadvantage versus your peer group. But I started my first. It was a software company. No surprise there. It was an enterprise CRM in the financial services sector, and bootstrapped it. And kind of, so it was self-funded, and I was the founder CEO of that company for a little over 10 years, and then ultimately sold it to a much bigger financial services software company, tech company, and then decided to go back to grad school. So that's kind of what happened in the intervening years. But yeah.
And was it a meaningful exit? Were you going into grad school with some money, or were you?
It was. So I'm relatively open and transparent. So the acquisition price was around $15 million, all closely held. And one thing I've kind of discovered about money is that, the kind of the first, and wherever you kind of happen to draw the line based on, what part of the world you live in, different amounts mean different things. But at least for me, like the first $4 or $5 million is like literally just life changing, right? It's like, okay, well, you don't have to work anymore. You have the ability to kind of do a few things. And so once you kind of cross that mark, I wasn't in debt anyway. I don't really believe in debt, but that was a life changing amount of money. And that was kind of partly the motivation for going back to grad school, because during undergrad, I was working full time the whole way through, right? So I take night courses and weekend courses, and it took me 7 years. I almost had to do some of those early classes again because curricula had kind of expired later, and they were going to take away some of those credits. But it took me 7 years to get my what should be a 4-year degree. And so when I went into grad school, I made the deliberate decision that I was going to be like a real student, right? I wasn't going to work. I didn't have to work. I was going to be a legitimate grad student and just apply myself. And I've always loved academics, so this was not a big sacrifice. So and I'd always had this aspiration to go to MIT. It's partly why I moved to the Boston area. And I moved to the Boston area in '99 and didn't apply to MIT until like 5 years later, where the stars kind of aligned. I was able to sell my prior company, which freed up the time and the capital to go do it. But yeah.
Well, and also I think having a little bit of money to bootstrap a company. I mean, I'm kind of bridging into the HubSpot story to start another company. That's a world of difference, right? You're not scrambling. You're not having to, like we were talking about before we started this conversation. There are a lot of entrepreneurs out there who are bootstrapping with a paycheck right now. So they are working. They're doing what you did during your undergraduate. They're working their day jobs, and they're doing nights and weekends to validate a startup idea. They're also doing all the learning on the job of the methodology building blocks, which now people expect that they would know because there's so much resources out there. So not having to do all that and being able to focus 100% on a venture when you're a bit further along in your journey and have a bit of resources to fund that, first, 18 months, 24 months of, your journey makes a massive, massive difference.
Yeah, one thing I'll add. So, I had 2 startups before HubSpot. My first one, and in the first one, it was bootstrapped, self-funded. And then I did a second one before the first one had actually sold. And this is like the biggest mistake of my professional career, is trying to be founder CEO of 2 startups at the same time. But when I did my second one, I had made some money, even though I hadn't had an exit yet. My first company had done reasonably well. And so I wrote the first $1 million seed check for my second startup, right? I'm like, okay, well, I don't have to do the scrappy bootstrap stuff anymore. I've got some cash. I'm just going to self-fund this and do my second startup idea. And the one thing, and this didn't the lesson didn't really hit for me until years later, but when I did my second startup, the automatic assumption I had in my head is that everything I did in my first one was a mistake. And because I didn't know anything, because I didn't have access to capital, and so in the second one, I'm like, oh, I'm going to do it completely differently this time. I'm going to start off with $1 million in capital. I'm going to not make some of the quote unquote mistakes. And the lesson learned was a lot of the things I did in that first startup, despite being ignorant about business overall, were the best things, right? It's like, running, running lean and being, relatively frugal, being kind of mindful and just being focused. All those were good things. So, and we'll talk about HubSpot in a little bit, but so HubSpot is what happened as a result of not swinging the pendulum too far the other way. So I took the best lessons I got from my first startup. It's like, okay, let's be disciplined about this. But still, it's like, let's be more ambitious. And so it's the best of both worlds in my mind. But that first startup experience, in those 10 years, I learned a lot. And all modesty aside, we got a fair number of things right. We got the culture right. We were focused on the customer and solving real problems. We were scrappy about it. So, and we're trying to carry those into HubSpot now.
Yeah. My take on all this is it's a good idea to think about your entrepreneurial journey, especially early on, in terms of a serial entrepreneurship journey. Very few people have the kind of hits that a Mark Zuckerberg, Bill Gates, or Steve Jobs have had as a first company becoming their life's work.
Yeah.
So I think for most entrepreneurs, thinking of doing something that is more manageable, that you don't have track record, you have no option but to bootstrap. Okay, bootstrap and get to some level of success, and then gradually build on your dream. I mean, one of my favorite case studies is Sridhar Vembu's story. He built this network management software, for 15 years before even starting to build out Zoho. And look at Zoho now; he could do it all without a penny of outside capital. So, so I think that's what you're echoing here, is that you had a lot more flexibility, and basically the point of having some resources is that freedom to be able to do things differently and do things without those existential pressures.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that notion of kind of serial entrepreneurship, that is fantastically good advice if you keep that in your mind, because and it plays in a couple of ways. One is, your first idea does not have to be the kind of world-changing biggest thing. I'm going to go off and try to build this, multi-billion-dollar business. It can be something more modest, as long as it solves a customer problem and it's real. I think that's completely encouraged and okay. But the other one is, when you get to the point of an exit, let's say there's an acquisition possibility. I think too many entrepreneurs sometimes like, oh, well, I'm meant to kind of slog this through all the way until it becomes this huge thing. And that's fine. If you're onto an idea and you're passionate about that idea, I encourage entrepreneurs to stick to it, but there's no shame in saying, hey, this particular idea kind of run its course. Maybe the company will be in better hands in the acquire. I'll get some money. And I've talked to hundreds of entrepreneurs, not quite as many as you, but not once have I met an entrepreneur that's only had a single idea in their entire life, right? Like entrepreneurs will have other ideas. It's like, okay, you're running this company, you can run it with as much focus as you possibly can. But then sometimes it's like, it's time to start the second chapter or the next chapter, wherever you are on your entrepreneurial journey. And it's okay to do that. Yeah.
So let's come to your third chapter. What was the genesis of HubSpot? What was going on in the industry, and what was going on in your life and your orbit that led to HubSpot? Yeah,
so HubSpot, first of all, was not supposed to happen. When I sold my first company, I had promised my wife that I'm not going to do startups anymore, right? It's like, okay, I've made the money I needed to make, but I had for 10 years, as long as she'd known me, because we had been together since before I'd even started a company, right? When I was still working as an engineer. So she had no idea that I was going to be an entrepreneur, and no one would have guessed that. So when I sold it after 10 years, I'm just like, okay, well, I don't need to work anymore. So my plan was to go to graduate school, get my master's degree, probably go get my PhD, and then go teach. That was the original plan. And so that was kind of step one, is going to MIT and going to grad school. But then the best laid plans, as they say. So while in grad school, I met my co-founder, Brian Halligan, and we just both had a shared passion for small and medium-sized businesses. We both came from tech, but had different. He came from a kind of sales and marketing background. I came from kind of product and engineering. And the one kind of observation, and this is while we're in class at MIT, right? So that's where HubSpot was essentially born. We had a thesis that was emerging, which is that marketing was kind of broken. The way most companies marketed, it's like, oh, I've got this budget, however big or small, I'm going to spend this budget to kind of take my message and kind of broadcast it to the world, right? I'm going to buy a long list of email addresses. I'm going to buy a long list of phone numbers and have people cold call. I'm going to take ads out if I can. I'm going to, on newspapers or on based on how big your budget was, TV shows or whatever it is. And all those methods have been fine for decades, but that over time, they had become less and less effective. And this is marketing that we call outbound marketing, right? You're kind of pushing your message out. Yeah. And the reason they were less effective is because humans got better at blocking marketing messages, right? We don't open spammy email anymore. We don't answer random calls without looking at caller ID. And we just are kind of immune to classic marketing. And so our thesis was, there's, now that the internet is here, there is a better way for companies to market, which is not based on how much money you have. It's based on how creative and how value adding you are, right? So start a blog, put a video out there, help your prospective customers learn the things they need to learn in their industry. And this is what we call inbound marketing, and we coined the term. And so the idea is take that same budget, however big or small, and instead of spending it all trying to blast the world with your message, spend it on creating value for your prospective customers, however that might be, in whatever media or channel you prefer. And that's a much more effective, sustainable way to grow a business. So that was the thesis. As it turns out, so we were right about that thesis, but the products needed to kind of execute on that and do inbound marketing and existed for big companies and sophisticated companies, but didn't really exist for mere mortal kind of small. If you were a 30-person law firm or a 50-person manufacturing firm, you didn't likely have the wherewithal to say, oh, I'm going to put WordPress up as a blog and I'm going to connect it to Google Analytics. I'm going to use Wufoo for my forums. I'm going to use this tool over here to post my blog to social media. And I'm going to try and pull all the analytics together and figure out which of my marketing efforts are working or not. The tools were out there and they were great tools, but no one had really pulled it all together. And so that was the genesis of HubSpot. That said, can we make it easy for small and medium-sized business to kind of get on the internet instead of sitting on the sidelines? They should be enjoying the benefits of this connected world and being able to kind of connect to their customers in much more efficient ways and grow. Can we make that possible for them? So that was the kind of idea behind it.
Dharmesh, put this in the timeline for us, and let's brainstorm a little bit about what was happening in the outer universe while you and Brian were hatching this.
Yep. So I'll take you back. So it's around 2005. The big term back then was Web 2.0. Tim O'Reilly had just coined. So there was this entire emergence around this kind of what Web 2.0 was essentially the second generation of the web, which is the first generation was people are putting simple websites up there in brochureware and things like that. Web 2.0 was essentially the interactive web, that instead of it just being static content, you could actually have applications on the web and do things. So that's what was happening. Salesforce was still a relatively young company, but Google Analytics existed, WordPress existed, but and some companies were leveraging the web. But, we take kind of blogging and all that for granted. But back in 2005, it was a relatively new thing, and the people that blogged. They didn't blog for business, right? They blogged for
in 2005. You were already blogging, right, in 2005?
I started in 2005, yeah.
Me too. So I think we both started blogging at the same time, because I guess that's when I started following you and you started following me, because there weren't that many people blogging, and blogging was not really understood because I just discovered blogging. I mean, I started blogging just as I discovered blogging. So I don't think people really understood blogging. So part of the inbound marketing thesis was that you were doing content marketing, you were producing content.
Yes.
Well, blogging kind of leads us into that concept, right?
It does, and there's actually an interesting kind of story in between, which is goes to the genesis. So recall that we had this, Brian and I had this idea that marketing was kind of broken, that it needed to shift from outbound to inbound marketing. He's like, okay, great. And Brian graduated a year ahead of me. So he graduated in 2005. And his first job after graduation was to work as an entrepreneur in residence at a venture capital firm here in the Boston area. And his job was to take all these portfolio companies and help them grow, right? And because he'd been VP of sales, he'd worked in sales and marketing his whole professional career. And he and I would still meet like weekly and just talk about kind of general ideas. And I was working on my thesis at MIT, trying to finish my academic work up. And here's the thing that kind of struck us both. So he was helping these portfolio companies, but then he would look at the traffic I was getting on my blog. He's like, Dharmesh, what are you doing on your blog that's getting all this traffic? I have these venture-backed rich people that have VPs of marketing, these are real companies with real budgets doing real marketing, and yet you're getting 10 times the traffic on your blog. Like, how is that? And my response was, oh, well, there's this kind of skill or this discipline called search engine optimization, where you can optimize your content so that you show up in Google search results. There are these new social media sites like Reddit, which had just started in that time frame. And so that way people, you kind of get traffic from all these different sources. And so this is when Brian said, oh, well, my portfolio companies need to do this. Like whatever you're doing on your blog, let's go do it over here in all these portfolio companies. And I'm like, oh, piece of cake. You put WordPress up, you put Google Analytics up, here are all those 18 things you need to do in order to kind of get online. And he's like, oh man, that's a science project. They don't have the time for that, right? Their developers are off building their product. They don't have the time to go off and figure out all this technology to make this happen. And so that was the kind of proverbial kind of spark, right? Which is we identified that there was this kind of business issue, this trend in the market where marketing was kind of broken, but the existing products, although great, were not easy enough, were not simple enough for most companies to use, and said, okay, so we'll go build that. And some of the best entrepreneurial advice I've given and I've heard is, when you're starting off as an entrepreneur, do like one thing really, really well. Like do that one thing and get really good at it, which I think is brilliant advice. HubSpot at its genesis did the exact opposite, right? We said, okay, we're going to build a blogging tool and social media and analytics and like all of it, and a website creator all on one platform. And when I get asked like, okay, well, why would you do something so crazy? And our response is that, the whole reason for HubSpot to exist, the problem as we saw it, was not that there weren't these tools out there. So we could have picked any one of those and said, well, we're not going to build a better analytics in Google Analytics or a better blog than WordPress. That's not the problem customers have. The problem is this stuff is just too hard. In order for us to make it easy, we're going to have to build all of it in an integrated way, the same way Apple might do, is to say, okay, in order to get non-consumers consuming, when they came out with the iPod, it wasn't, oh, we can hold more gigabytes or the gigabytes per dollar. It wasn't any of that. It was like, oh, in order to enjoy digital music at that time, it's like you had to sort of know about technology, what an MP3 file was, and go to Napster or some of these illegal websites in order to get the music on your device. Like most people couldn't enjoy digital music. And Apple said, hey, we're going to give you a device, for sure you need that, but we're going to also have this software called iTunes, and we're also going to have content partnerships with all the music studios. And so we're going to allow millions of people to enjoy digital music. It's not like they invented the MP3 player. They just made it accessible. And we didn't invent the marketing stack or marketing tools. We just made them accessible to an audience or a group of companies that just couldn't cross that line before. That was a...
So, Dharmesh, one question that comes to my mind here is how much of those existing tools were you able to bring into your product design as that first, let's say version 1 of HubSpot? Was it possible to integrate WordPress into that product, Google Analytics into that product, or did you have to do all of that from scratch?
We did it from scratch, and this, and here was our, it's in hindsight, entrepreneurs are really good at rationalizing past actions, but our thinking was that we could have tried to take WordPress and Google Analytics and kind of integrate them into this kind of larger platform, but then we wouldn't have been able to control the user experience in a way that we needed to control, right? So, and once again, this is like the Apple way. It's kind of a fully integrated experience versus kind of cobbling together a bunch of different pieces, because you have to kind of control the boundaries and be able to control the user experience in order to make it easy enough. And that was what we thought our overall mission was. And so we didn't build Google Analytics into it. We actually recreated it. We recreated WordPress. We recreated everything. And every line of code essentially was kind of built from scratch, which had some implications, right? The big downside was the product was kind of 9 miles wide and like 2 inches deep. And so every one of its categories, the product sucked, right? Like if you look at every individual piece of HubSpot back in those years, they wouldn't even make the top 3, top 4 in that category. And that was both deliberate and unavoidable. We didn't have the engineering staff or the resources, or at the time, let's say we had infinite money, to have the leading blogging application, or the leading social media, or the leading analytics. And one of the weird things I told the team back then is that if we have any one of our, let's say, 8 tools that is the number 1 or number 2 in its category, then we have misallocated resources, because that is not the goal. The goal is not to be number 1 or 2. The goal is to have this breadth, and the kind of sum of the parts. The whole is greater than some of the parts. So, and over time, this is, we raised capital and obviously built out the product and engineering team. Over time, those individual tools now are in the most of them are in the top 3 in their individual categories, but that was not the case for the first 5-7 years of the company.
And what was your funding strategy? So once you and Brian hit upon this idea that you were going to build a comprehensive closed system to do all these functions that you would otherwise have to piecemeal stitch together.
Yep.
How did you fund that early stage?
So I had the luxury of having recently, at that time, sold my first company. So now I had this cash, and so I wrote the initial $500,000 check. It wasn't the $1 million check that I had written in my, even though I had more money, the check was smaller on my third startup, which is HubSpot. But and the motivation there was, it was just enough money for us to kind of avoid some of the screwing we'd have to do, but not so much that we were going to use it unwisely, right? So I thought that was a good mix. But then it was a classic, as we were progressing, we recognized that it was a kind of venture backable deal, right? And one of the pieces of advice I give to entrepreneurs is too many of them make the mistake to say, okay, I have this idea, I'm going to go do this thing. And the first thing I'm going to do is create a pitch deck and go start pitching investors to kind of get money. And that most of the time is a distraction, right? Because lots of great ideas that could conceivably turn into great businesses are just not great venture backable businesses. Those are not the same thing, right? Just because your company or your idea is not venture backable does not make it a bad business, right? In our case, it just so happens, and this is partly by design, when Brian and I started it, I had already made some money. I had promised my wife I was not going to do another startup. So in order to do this, both of us were like, okay, we had the proverbial kind of co-founder chat before starting the company, which was in 2006 was when we officially launched it. I didn't want to launch it until after I graduated, just because I made myself the promise I was going to be a student and enjoy being a student. But it's like, okay, well, we're going to need the money. This is a classic venture backable deal, and we are going to swing for the fences. We want to build a spectacular outcome that's going to be a big, sustainable, meaningful, impactful company, or it's going down in crashing, burning flames. We didn't want another kind of modest outcome exit. That wasn't going to change my life, wasn't going to change Brian's life. So this was our, in baseball terms, like our last step up to bat. And we wanted to take full advantage of that. So we made the decision early on day one of the company, that anytime there was a fork in the road, we were going to take the fork that was increase our probability of having that spectacular success, even though it also increased the probability that we might go down in crashing, burning flames. So we raised 5 rounds of private capital, totaling about $105 million, and then subsequently went public. But yeah.
And that first round of capital, did it come from Brian's firm?
It did not. So Brian's firm, it's funny. So as we were kind of growing, here's another piece of good kind of funding advice. So Brian had worked for a VC. I had had a successful exit. We had both graduated from MIT. And both had somewhat of a network. We were, I won't say we were proven entities, but we, in the grand scheme of things,
entrepreneurs
we were fundable,
already.
right? We were fundable, and I think we do a pretty good job with the pitch. And so in the early stages, we weren't accepting funding. So I had just written the $500,000 check. We had done another like $1 million angel round of just friends and family and people that we knew that we had kind of deposited in the bank. We hadn't even used it, and then we got introduced to a local venture capital firm, and not Brian's firm, a different one, through a friend, a classmate of ours at MIT. And we even told that classmate, like, we're not raising funding. Dharmesh wrote the first 500,000. We just put $1 million in the bank. We're not looking for money. That's not our thing right now, because we're not even sure how to spend the $1 million that we have. We're just kind of heads down trying to make the product better. And they're like, no, they're great guys. And it's like, okay, fine. If they want to come visit us in our office, which is a tiny little office that had 4 desks, they're welcome to do so. We're not raising funding, but there's nothing secret about what we're doing. We're happy to tell them. And from what we've heard, VCs are relatively smart, and this company had a good reputation, this firm. And it's like, it'll be free advice, right? It's like we can ask them, we can kind of bounce some ideas off of them, but we're not raising money. And so they came in, we gave them the pitch, and it's like, we're not raising money, you're not raising money. And then I think it was like a few months later, we're like, okay, you know what? Things are going well. We're likely going to raise money someday. If the terms are reasonable, why not go ahead and get that kind of past us? And we'll go ahead. And so we went out to do a classic Series A of $5 million, and we reached out to that venture capital firm. And it was funny. And it's so the kind of moral of the story is this: despite the fact that we had a bunch of chips in our favor, right? We were reluctant raisers. I could have kept writing checks, so we had access to angel. It's like, okay, well, the company was making progress. It was hard raising our Series A. It was not just well, money fell out of the sky, because obviously they had so much interest and they were taking this meeting, and we had all the, so you'd think you would have had all the power in that particular dynamic, and it was not easy. And the reason it was not easy is because we were in the small business space, and there was only one other company that ever made a successful, focused on small business software company, and that's Intuit. And that intersected with the fact that we were in the marketing space. Nobody had created anything of any magnitude. So the biggest exit the company had seen, or the industry had seen, was Omniture, which sold for like $1.5 billion to, I think, Adobe. No one, like, marketing was a arts and crafts. Like, oh, you have like a small marketing team and they have a budget, but then you hire an agency to do your logo, and it's not something that software was used for a lot. This is in 2005, and so we had a tough time with the Series A.
Yeah, and I think I kind of feel like it's not a bad thing to have a tough time raising a Series A, because most likely you're doing something new.
Yep.
And the market is not crawling with 27 other competitors who are trying to raise money for exactly the same idea.
Yep.
And the problem with that 27 competitors trying to raise money for the same idea is that it's very noisy. Yes. And noisy markets are very difficult to penetrate.
Yes, and very expensive, right? Because it just raises the average cost of acquiring the same customer, because so many people are fighting over that base set of customers. But yeah, I agree.
Yeah. So I know we have a limited amount of time, so I'll let you pick what are the highlights of the HubSpot journey that you want to underscore and discuss. So what is the next inflection point that had strategic insight as well as creativity and so forth that's worth discussing?
Okay, so one, and this is something I would share. So people look at HubSpot as this kind of success story, and the thing I would kind of remind our viewers in the audience and the entrepreneurs out there is that HubSpot did not start with a particularly brilliant idea. So if you take our kind of modest success so far, most of it is attributed to 2 things. One is a kind of maniacal focus on the customer problem. So we picked our customer base, like here's who we're out to serve, and had a maniacal focus on sticking to that problem, number one, but not kind of wavering at all. So every board meeting we've ever had, when we went on the IPO roadshow, everyone would ask us, like, okay, it's great that you started in small business, but what is your plan to go to the enterprise? Because that's where everybody does. And we resisted that. And I think that has served us well, which is kind of focus on that customer. And the second thing, which is underrated, is just raw execution. We, over time, we're fortunate enough to bring great people onto the team, and of all modesty aside, we could have taken that kind of early team and even the later team, and we could have parachuted them into different business. Like, okay, we're not doing marketing and CRM software anymore. We're doing this over here. And I think they would have succeeded. And it's the culture of the company was strong. The focus on the customer, whoever that customer was strong. And one thing, if I had to, impart one piece of kind of advice, is that most entrepreneurs don't spend enough time thinking about the culture they want to create. And I understand that hesitation. It's because, oh, we're 3 people, we've got product to build and product to sell and funds to raise and all these things. Culture is something bigger companies worry about. It's like, we'll worry about that when we get there. And there's some truth to that. But the reality is, and you don't have to, write a 100-page, document on what your culture is going to be. But the earlier you can kind of manifest the kind of company, it doesn't have to be fancy, but it's like, here's the kind of company we want to build. Here are the kinds of people we want to be around and work with. What are those? And there's no right answer, right? It's like in HubSpot's case, it's like we like people that are kind of humble and transparent. Those are 2 of our core values. And there, you might have another company that's equally or even more successful. It's like, no, we like aggressive people that are, that are killers and go out there in the market and crush the competition. That's not our mindset. Those are not the people that we hire at HubSpot. And so whatever it is, whatever kind of company you want to build, get that documented, and ideally get that out, like on your website, so that as people are looking at your company as a possible place to join, they'll both self-select in, oh, that feels like the kind of company I want to join. But if they're not a good fit, they'll self-select out, and it'll save you a bunch of time. Because if you end up hiring people that are not a culture fit, right, out of desperation, which often happens, people make this mistake, HubSpot's made this mistake, you incur what I call culture debt. So we understand technology debt, right? It's like, oh, that's when you take a shortcut in a piece of code. We understand financial debt because that's been around forever. It's like, oh, I'm going to use this cash because I need it now in order to grow or do this thing, but I know I'm going to have to pay it back with interest over time. Same with technology debt. I know I'm going to have to pay it back with interest over time. In both of those examples, with technology debt and finance debt, you can just pay it off and you're done. It's like, okay, I wrote the check, I'm out of financial debt. I rewrote that code, I'm out of technology debt. When you take a shortcut on culture and incur a culture debt, the interest rate is super high. You may not recognize it at the time, but then it's very hard to pay off completely. Like, let's say you hire a complete jerk as employee 6 in the company, and other people join. It's like, oh yeah, because it kind of signals what kind of company you're willing, what kind of behavior you're willing to tolerate, what kind of company you are. And even if you let that person go, which you hopefully will, kind of some of that toxicity has kind of seeped in, right, into the soil, so to speak. Yeah. It's going to be much harder to kind of unroot that over time. So my advice would be, don't spend hundreds of hours, but spend a day, spend a weekend with your co-founders and have that conversation. It's like, okay, who do we want? How do we make decisions? What kind of culture do we want to have? Once again, no right or wrong answers, but it makes life much easier as you go.
So a follow-up to that question, I know you have hired a lot from MIT. Mm-hmm. Some of what you're talking about, my experience of MIT, when I was going to MIT, I did my undergraduate at Smith College in Western Massachusetts. And when I got into MIT, I was in ECS. I was in the PhD program in ECS, and I left out with a master's to go full-time with my company. I had already started my first company while at MIT. But when I was going from Smith to MIT, I had just got the acceptance. One of the head of the department of computer science said to me that just because you got in doesn't mean you should go. And I was like, oh, here's a bucket of cold water on my enthusiasm. I was like, ready to jump up and down. And his point was that MIT is a very cutthroat environment, and Smith was a small, very nurturing environment, and going on to this cutthroat environment, you may not enjoy it. And my experience of MIT was completely different from that. I didn't find MIT cutthroat. I found MIT people humble. I found them intellectually honest. And there was no cattiness, none of the level of intellectual exchange and dialogue was stimulating, and I just grew so much, and I felt so comfortable in that environment, in that I didn't have to be politically correct. I didn't have to worry about hurting other people's feelings. I could be intellectually honest. And the combination of humility and intellectual honesty and just brilliance, pure brilliance, was, I thought, very unique. And I think what you're describing in your cultural choices at HubSpot is a bit of translating that culture into HubSpot, as opposed to a culture of, raw aggression and cutting corners, stepping over people and just kind of, tolerating assholes, as you said.
Yep. It's funny you should say that. So in the first kind of few years of HubSpot, we almost treated, and I agree with your sentiment and your experience at MIT, that was exactly my experience, right? People that were humble and collaborative, that you kind of enjoyed being around. It was not this competitive.
Extremely collaborative. Extremely collaborative.
Yeah, and it wasn't about the grades. It wasn't about that. It was about learning, and it was about debate. We can have an animated, rigorous debate on topics that we may or may not agree on. But we carried that same kind of sentiment. So the first few years of HubSpot were basically an extension of graduate school. Like, it was exactly the same. We had that same kind of, let's get on the whiteboard, let's debate this. Any person on the original exec team could argue either side of a particularly heated issue that we weren't able to kind of resolve. It's like, okay, there are kind of strong cases to be made on each side, and that worked. And so then we kind of documented that culture, right? It's like, and we have this 128 slide deck called the Culture Code, and you just go to culturecode.com to look at it. But it shares with the world like how HubSpot works, and we've taken elements out of MIT and just things that we've learned over the years. But that was impactful, right? So, and the thing that kind of we're in a very competitive space at HubSpot across all the kind of product categories we compete in. But I think one of the things that it's hard to build a sustainable competitive advantage in software these days. It really is, because software it's not easy, but it's easier than it was before. So the advantages these days are a combination of like a business model change. You're just going to approach the same kind of category, not with a product that may be radically different from the existing products, but either pricing is different or your approach to business is different, and a kind of focus on culture and people. Like if you can attract that team, I know it's going to sound cliched, but you want to build a culture that's going to attract the best and the brightest in the world. And our experiences now, most of those people gravitate more towards that humble stance versus being the killer type. Yes, those are still out there, but even if you look at the leadership across tech now, so you look at the next generation of leaders, you look at Satya at Microsoft, even Sundar at Google, you look at the Adobe CEO, it's like these are all much more humble leaders than their predecessors, not the Larry Ellison Oracle gene, right? It's they're more mindful, more thoughtful leaders that are the most successful in some of the best companies.
More human.
More human, exactly. More empathetic. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So, how many years did it take you to go from through the $105 million of financing into the IPO?
So let's see. We started in 6, so it took us up, we'll say, a little over 7 years.
A little over 7 years.
Yeah.
So this is basically what VCs are looking for, to go from 0 to 100 million in 5 to 7 years and having an exit. Yep. This is the VC timeline effectively, and what you pointed out earlier, and we point out all the time, is that not every entrepreneur has a venture that is amenable to that kind of timeline. This is super hyper growth. Hyper growth is not the natural state of business. Hyper growth is rare. Hyper growth is unique. So, but don't take that as a rejection. If you don't have a company that is going to go through hyper growth, so what? You build a company, when next time around you can build something that has hyper growth, but don't get stuck on being venture capital friendly as your first venture, especially if you're a first-time entrepreneur.
I agree. I mean, entrepreneurs should focus on solving the customer's problem, not the investor's problem, right? The investors have like, oh, here's what we're looking for in order for this to make sense, which is fine. If your idea and your profile and your path happens to match that, great. But if not, I think it's a bad idea to spend a bunch of cycles trying to convince investors that this is a backable, venture-worthy idea. If you took those same calories and just applied them to solving your customers' problems, you would have a much better business and a much better time. Because it's actually very deflating to be rejected by VCs. Like my first company, we didn't try that much hard. Maybe like in the later years, in year 7 or 8, we thought about raising venture capital. We were in a relatively big market, But we were never successful in raising venture capital, and this was a company that was doing reasonably well. Yeah, so it's not fun being rejected by a bunch of VCs.
No,
it's much more fun building things
my,
and building a business.
I raised money for Intarka, 47 no's, and then 48 was NEA that wrote the check. And my crime was that I was doing product development in India. Well, everybody does product development in India now, but it was too early and it was not known and not understood at the time. So, okay, well, I know you've been investing aggressively for a long time now as an angel. What are your, how do you think about investment? What is the investment thesis? What are the lessons from the trenches as an investor?
Sure. So I got started in angel investing because I had promised my wife I was not going to do another startup. So I was in grad school and I thought of angel investing as a way to live vicariously through other entrepreneurs, right? I was like, I'm going to miss the startup thing, which I already was doing. And this is a little bit like the analogy I use is, for me, it was like having nieces and nephews, right? You get to play with them and they're cute and awesome, but then you get to hand them back to your parents and go back to your life, right? And get your sleep. And so I started writing angel checks while I was a student in grad school. And my first 2 angel investments were classmates at MIT. And then when we decided to start HubSpot, I had a kind of fork in the road. I had to make a decision. It's like, okay, well, what do I do about the angel investing? And I'm a very, very big believer in focus, especially after I had made the mistake of doing 2 startups at the same time. I'm like, I'm never going to make that kind of mistake again. And so, but I thought it would be useful to do angel investing in order to because it does kind of keep you plugged into what's going on in the world and in tech. And so I made a decision when I started formally kind of angel investing. I said, okay, HubSpot's my preoccupation, my first priority, my number 1 focus. And when I do angel investing, I'm going to be solving for time, not money. So my goal is not to create a return on the investments that I'm making. My goal is to minimize the time that I spend making those investments, because all of my time, 99% of my time should be invested in HubSpot. And so so once I had that first principle of like solve for time, not money, a bunch of decisions kind of and constraints and guardrails kind of flowed from that, which is, so I've done 95 angel investments across my angel investment career. Most of them, vast majority of them, I've never met the founders, never talked to them on the phone because that takes time. I've never done due diligence. Most of my decisions are within the first 24 hours of encountering the idea because I don't have time to do due diligence. I never lead a deal because leading a deal means you have to negotiate terms. Say, here's what the overall structure is going to be. Because that takes time, I don't lead deals. It's like, okay, someone else has to lead it, and I will let someone else set the terms, and I'm never going to negotiate terms. I will take whatever terms someone else has come up with. I never have, historically, I will never do follow-ons, because then that requires tracking my entire portfolio to figure out which ones I should be betting on kind of next. And if I bet on some and not others, there's a signaling problem. It's like, why didn't Dharmesh do the follow-on round for this thing as well? Because he doesn't do follow-on rounds, right? That's an easy answer to give when people ask me. So anyway, that has been my MO. Sort of solving for time, not money. And I don't know if I just got lucky, which I did, and so then the natural question is like, okay, what kinds of startups do you pick? What do you invest in versus not invest in? And even though I don't meet the founders, I still like to believe that I invest in people. It's just that my set of inputs is different than having founder meetings and things like that. I can tell you in like 150-word email whether someone is a jerk or not, right? You can tell, like, arrogance almost always seeps out. And then you can look at their kind of responsiveness and just how they kind of handle themselves online. Especially if they're blogging, they're on social media. It's kind of easy, I think, easier to read people. I invest in ideas that I would use myself, that I understand. So I have not done anything particularly crazy. It's all been software, something that I understand. But I would take and I'm not private about my portfolio at all, but I would take my angel portfolio and put it up against any early stage investor on the planet, including VCs. I've had some really, really big hits. Which is what you need to do in investor land, is have some 100x kind of outcomes on a few.
Which ones are your big hits?
So Coinbase was a big hit. That's 100x plus return. I was first money in Okta, which now has a market cap of $30-40 billion, publicly traded company, another MIT Sloan founder. Dropbox, trying trying to think. I'm in AngelList on the angel side, which is $1 billion, in Stack Overflow, which just got acquired. Life 360, which went public. I haven't done the math yet, but I think I've already returned 30 times my original investment, and I still have a bunch of kind of unicorn level companies still in the portfolio. But yeah.
So two of the ones that you mentioned in there are MIT founders, Todd and Drew, right?
Yep.
So
Yep.
Is that a big factor in your portfolio? What percentage of your investments are in the MIT community?
A fair number. I would say probably maybe close to 10 are from the community.
Yeah.
But I may not have had contact through that particular network, and it may be just happenstance that they happen to be MIT founders. I didn't actively go, especially except for my kind of early investments, actively go seeking MIT entrepreneurs, but it just turned out that way. The number one thing I kind of solve for is, do they have the same disposition? It's like the question I ask in my head is this the kind of person I would hire at HubSpot? Do they have the same kind of value?
Yeah.
And the founders I invest in, kind of manifest those values. So if you look at Drew or Freddie from Okta, they're just good people. I don't know how else to say it, right? They're just good people, high integrity, not arrogant, and not lacking confidence by any stretch. But yeah, just good people.
And do you accept pitches directly, or are you accepting pitches from people who have chosen to lead the round and want to bring you in? What's the process that you follow to manage your time?
Yeah, mostly the latter. So I don't look at kind of direct pitches that are sent to me. Once again, solving for time, not money. So most of the kind of quote unquote deal flow comes from my immediate network or from someone leading around, and it could be an angel or a VC that's doing a round and invites me in because they know my areas of interest. A lot of times, I've invested in the same founder across multiple companies, so I've done that several times. In my experience so far, the sample size is small, as that those second companies end up doing much better than the first ones. They learn their lessons, do much better. But yeah, it's like and some of it, will come, like the Coinbase one was a little bit of rare things. I had this kind of strong belief in cryptocurrency back when that wasn't as cool as it is today. And I wasn't sure that Coinbase was going to be the one to kind of pull it off, but I'm like, someone is going, like, this thing needs to exist. Someone's going to do it. This feels like, as good a bet as any as far as what things were going on at that time. So I like to, and so I'll leave you with this. I have a mini framework for assessing ideas, and it works both internally if you're assessing ideas within your company or making investments. Number one thing I look at is the potential, which is if everything went correctly, if all the stars align, the founders achieved their vision, how big could this conceivably be? What's the overall kind of upper limit? Number two is the kind of probability of that outcome, right? And so this is the geek in me. It's like, okay, so the mistake a lot of people make is they'll look at the probability of success of any particular idea and say, oh, I only have a 1% chance of pulling this off, and so I'm not going to do it. That's the high order filter. It's like, oh, odds are too low. When I think the right way to approach it is a statistical way, which is calculate the expected value. Now, don't just look at the probability of success, multiply that by the outcome if that thing is successful, and look at the expected value statistically of the thing. And the third P is around passion or proximity. Am I excited about this particular idea, or is it close? Is it proximate to things that I know and things that I care about that I can bring some expertise to the table? And so across those three factors, I look for the right kind of mix. Does it have the potential? Is there a decent chance that they'll pull this off based on the team? And am I excited about it? That's yeah.
And two questions out of that. One is, who name of few people who constantly refer you deals, so that if we want our entrepreneurs here to want to work with you, whom do they need to go through?
Let's see. Well, the kind of usual suspects are anyone that's put money in HubSpot, because that I have that network. So if you look through all of our rounds, General Catalyst here from now Boston on the West Coast, Matrix Partners, Sequoia is in there. So all of those, definitely. Or it might be even easier is any founder that I've invested in. So my portfolio is online. So if you happen to be connected to one of my founders and they know you and can kind of say, hey, Dharmesh, I will open those pitches. I will read those pitches and those emails. If any of my existing portfolio companies say, hey, this founder is special. There's something really, really cool about this company. I will take a look. The good news about me is that although I don't add any value because I don't sit on advisory boards, I don't take mentoring kind of roles because I'm solving for time, not money. I am also the lowest maintenance investor in the world, right? I will never, ever. I always side with the entrepreneur. Doesn't matter what the issue is. Yeah, so I'm not gonna make you do a bunch of work, and I'll deliver a decision in 24 hours. So at least it'll be clear. I'm not gonna make you spin your wheels and give you homework to do.
So last question before we adjourn. I know we are at the end of the time that you had reserved for us. What needs to exist out there that you are looking to invest in?
A couple of things, and these are a little bit niche-y. One I just talked about recently on, HubSpot has a podcast called The Hustle. It's a great podcast, and the episode just went live yesterday. So look up The Hustle, Dharmesh, and you'll see it. But I'll tell you briefly the idea. I think a professional network needs to exist. So we have social networks and multiple ones, Twitter, Facebook. In the professional network world, we really only have one, which is LinkedIn, which kind of has a dominant position, now owned by Microsoft. I think there's time, and I love the people at LinkedIn. I think the product has stalled a little bit, and I think it was great for its time. But I think someone needs to build something like that, either kind of more focused on individual verticals and kind of split it up, or a different take on what LinkedIn is. I have kind of details around what that would look like. So that's number one. Number two is I think applying natural language processing, not necessarily voice, but just natural language processing to software interfaces. I think that's going to be a mega trend, and I'll give you the 45-second kind of pitch on why that is the case. So most software companies, when they build a product, they will say, "Oh, our product is really intuitive to use," right? It's like, "Oh, it's easy, easy and intuitive." That's the kind of common pitch, and I think that's misleading because most software is absolutely not intuitive. That is not the word that comes to mind, because here's the way it works. It's like, okay, I have this thing I want to do with this piece of software. I have to take the thing that I want to do and translate that into a series of clicks and drags and touches, whatever, based on my knowledge of that software. So I'm translating my intent into this thing that I want the software to do, right? And that takes calories, and that is not intuitive. What would be intuitive is like, let's say you're using Photoshop. I'll just take that as an example. And instead of learning, it's like, okay, I want to take the background off of this image, or I want to remove the ship, or whatever the thing may be. You should just be able to type, remove the background off this image, turn it to black and white, whatever it happens to be, right? I shouldn't have to go, it's like, oh, I know I need to kind of select that thing, and then I do an edit and do layers and do all this stuff. And it shouldn't be a series of 14 steps. My intent is very clear. We have the technology now in terms of NLP. It works well enough to do the kind of things I'm talking about. But I think the reason I call it a mega trend is that idea is applicable across hundreds of industries, right? So we were, so that we had the last two big shifts we've seen in terms of software. One was the shift to the web. So now, oh, the world is connected. We don't have to have client software. You can run the software over a browser. Awesome. Then we went to mobile. So we're going to, it's like, oh, all the things you used to do at your desk, now you can do mobile, and it opens up some new use cases. Awesome. But this would be another kind of nonlinear jump in making software accessible, where it's basically transparent. You just express, and so for instance, even like business apps, I'll give myself a hard time. It's like, okay, every analytics app, it's like, okay, well, in order to find out how many customers you sold over the last 90 days that were from California, you go to their reporting tool and you say, okay, I'm looking for customers, not prospects. I'm going to pick the geo, and then I want to sort it by, opportunity value or whatever it is. Well, that, you have to learn that. Why not just be able to say, show me how many customers did I sign up from California last quarter? I should just type that question in, and the system should be able to give me an answer. That is not rocket science. Elon's putting people on Mars. We can do this. So I think that's an interesting opportunity. Anything kind of applying that to any given industry or any given piece of software, that'll be another leap. So any company that has that feature over time wins out over those that don't. Just like the web. The web replaced all the client server apps, and the companies that industries didn't have web-based applications, people made bazillions of dollars just creating web versions of old client software and did a really good job. I think that solved the problem. Anyway, I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, no, very good, very good. So I think we should stop there. It was a marvelous conversation, as I expected. Normally we have guests for half an hour, and I had requested Dharmesh to give us an hour to do this interview, just because I knew you were going to be so generous and so insightful. So I hope, audience, you've enjoyed this, and I'm sure a lot of people will be listening to this in recording as well. We are not doing entrepreneur pitches today, folks. So we're going to spend a few minutes going over 1M, and then we are going to have a little bit of time for Q&A. Dharmesh, if you need to go, please feel free. I'm not going to.
Normally I would have stayed, but my son is home from summer camp today, so I've got to kind of break away. But thanks for having me. Sorry I was a little bit long-winded about some of the things, but hopefully the folks will find it useful.
You were awesome. Nothing short of awesome. See you soon. Bye. Take care. Okay. Folks, if you like what we do in 1 Million by 1 Million, refer the program to other serious entrepreneurs. We have a terrific network. We have terrific methodology that works. And as you heard from Dharmesh today, a lot of what we do is what he believes in as well. And here's somebody who has done it before in a very significant way multiple times. And, it's good validation of the kind of methodology that we practice. And that methodology is very much, do not go to VCs as beggars, go as kings. Entrepreneurship equals customers, revenues, and profits. Financing is optional, exit is optional. So these are the mantras of 1 Million by 1 Million, and a lot of very successful entrepreneurs practice those mantras. So in terms of resources, go to 1Mby1M.com. You'll find everything we offer there. The program is very well described. The blog is very accessible and very active. You'll find lots of information in that blog. The Entrepreneur Journeys book series is 12 volumes, and you will learn a lot through there. You can start your learning journey there. We have these roundtables every week. This is the 537th session. Our full acceleration program is the premium program. You will get extensive methodology guidance, access to our digital curriculum, help with business development. You can access our network. We do similar strategy consulting sessions as the free roundtables in the private roundtables. That's where we do the coaching, mentoring, strategy consulting, whatever you call it, but really working on your projects on an interactive basis. We help you with financing. We have a terrific network of hundreds of investors who work with us, and we help you with media relations. Do the self-assessment on the website. It will give you the due diligence questions that you're going to need to answer if you go out to fundraise. You should ask these questions of yourself. The bootstrapping course is a very good starting point. It's free. It's pinned to the top of the blog. By all means, if you engage with 1M, do that course, because you'll learn a lot about how we think about entrepreneurship. And a lot of successful entrepreneurs think about entrepreneurship today the same way that we do. Things are changing. We are moving into a different world where bootstrapping is becoming much more of a core methodology that entrepreneurs follow. We have started releasing, we have actually thousands of hours worth of curriculum material that we have developed over the last 15 plus years. We have started packaging them up into short Udemy courses. We have our own course material. You can access the 1M curriculum by going to 1M Basic, which is $99 a month for all of the 1 Million by 1 Million curriculum. But for very little money, you can also access the Udemy courses. We have released about 25 of them. They are priced at like $40 each. And Udemy offers deep discounts. So you can, if you be strategic and if you kind of monitor Udemy, you should be able to acquire them between 10 to $15 per piece. And in about 3 to 6 hours, you're going to learn lots of stuff for that $10 to $12 investment. So I strongly encourage you to do that. Anyway, the website is very rich, 1Mby1M.com. You will be able to understand what the programs offer, FAQs, video FAQs, a full description of our curriculum. Go check all that out. We have thousands of case studies of entrepreneurs, and all that is what builds the curriculum out. We do make investor introductions. We have a terrific network of investors. Our methodology, however, is bootstrap first, raise money later. So one of the Udemy courses is just that, bootstrap first, raise money later. Please check that out. And that is it. We have 3 more free roundtables in July, so please come and register to pitch if you would like to have a conversation about your venture. And now we're ready for Q&A. If anybody wants to ask questions, please either activate your computer audio or dial into this line or ask questions in the public chat. Whichever way you want to do it is fine. If you have questions about the 1M program, Irina Patterson on our team is your contact, irina@1M1M.com. And that is what we have today in scheduled programming. Any questions, folks? I hope you enjoyed the conversation with Dharmesh. That is a superb conversation, really a deep dive into the mind of an entrepreneur who has really done a superb job of navigating his journey and delivering to the world a fantastic company. Well, Mamadou Ibrahim says, none at all, this roundtable was very insightful. Indeed, it was a fantastic conversation with Dharmesh. All right, folks, we are going to adjourn, and we'll be back here next week. See you soon. Thank you for coming today. Bye.